Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and today we have another interview. We're talking with Alice Hill, who is the co-author with Leo Martinez of Building a Resilient Tomorrow, How to Prepare for the Coming Climate Disruption, which was released just this week by Oxford University Press. Alice, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Now, you and your co-author were both senior officials in the Obama administration. You're currently a senior fellow at the Climate Change Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Obviously, you've been thinking about this for a long time, but why is the book an important book for us to be reading now?
The book recognizes that we absolutely must cut our emissions, no question about that. But it also raises the alarm that we need to deal with the impacts, which are already here. This isn't an issue for 2100. It's not just about polar bears. It's about impacts to communities across the globe, including the United States right now.
Now, what you did is you took a very policy and fact-based approach to looking at the impact on cities in particular and how cities and state governments need to be thinking about this, not simply the federal government. Can you give us an example of a city that's an exemplar, the best example for all the communities based on what they face in a climate change scenario?
Well, you see with cities and communities, typically they experience a no more moment. That is a very devastating event occurs and they decide to change how they've done business. There are a lot of examples of those types of cities, but one city in particular has taken this on before the catastrophe has occurred, and that's Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk and the surrounding communities are called Hampton Roads. They are an unusual conglomeration of national security assets for the United States. It has the largest naval base in the world, about 30 federal installations, and the area is suffering from a deep challenge with sea level rise. You know, sea level rise is not like a bathtub. It's not as if you climb in the bathtub when it's full of water and it all rises up at the same rate. There are deep variations as to which areas will suffer more sea level rise, and Norfolk happens to be one of those areas that will suffer deeply. It's experiencing a very rapid rate of sea level rise. It's also subsiding, that is, the land is sinking. So they're seeing their docks go underwater, but they're also seeing sunny day flooding. And that means that during a high tide, they see flood waters come over. But this city has resolved to do better. So they have taken on the issue. They have a challenge with inequality. About 20% of their population is below the poverty line. They have instances where they cannot provide sufficient protection, so they will have to retreat from the coast. In fact, their then Republican mayor said that he was the first person who had ever publicly uttered the words as a mayor of managed retreat, and they have organized themselves in a partnership with the Department of Defense and other community members to figure out how they can address this very deep challenge.
So the challenge is something that we're constantly bringing into greater focus, and you use a term, which I think is an important term for people to understand, especially when they look at the science and they say, well, it seems to change all the time. But that is climate attribution. And that really is, we're resolving our focus on this problem as it becomes more clearly documented. How should we be thinking about this changing view, because the climate attribution models are getting better?
Well, that's the fascinating thing about climate science. The science is improving at such a rapid rate. So our understanding, of course, is improving as a result of that. And one area is our ability to essentially fingerprint what's happening with a particular climate event. So it used to be whenever I spoke, I had to say, you know, you cannot say a particular event was caused or worsened by climate change. But now, with attribution science, it's basically a forensic examination. You can tell if an event has been worsened by climate change. For example, Harvey was worsened. We know that Sandy was worsened. Many of these big storms, the wildfires are worsened. So we have scientists who can go and look at the records and say, this wouldn't have occurred, or it wouldn't have been, it's 20% worse than it would have been without climate change. Why that's important, of course, is it informs our understanding, but it also can inform choices going forward as to how we build, and it can drive further litigation, because once we know that these events are in fact worsened, it's a little bit difficult for people to say the science is too uncertain for us to be able to plan for this.
So there could be a show called CSI Climate Change, is what you're saying.
I think so, and I think some of the meteorologists are already working on this. You'll see on your local TV station that meteorologists, for the most part, are already identifying the climate risks. So it's finding its way into common parlance.
And we certainly see that there's a much broader awareness, and it's not simply because of the news, but we're being informed more completely about it every day. Now, you suggest in the book that people and communities essentially lawyer up to raise climate issues in court. How do you anticipate the changes in litigation and policy coming into conflict over the next few years as we better understand these crises and start to respond? Is there going to be a lot of legal conflict, or is there an opportunity for mediation and resolution towards some sort of better approach to running our society?
There's always opportunity for mediation and settlement. In fact, one of the big cases we saw early on in Sandy was a rate increase by Con Edison after their electrical system had many failures. They wanted to increase rates, and one of the compromises reached was that they would take $1 billion of the increase and put it to resilience. So that's a very positive use of the legal system. The legal system is, for at least in civil litigation, is often about finding the deepest pockets. And when it comes to climate change, there are going to be very great expenses involved. The cases typically fall into two categories. The first is cases that tend to go after the fossil fuel giants, the Exxons, the Chevrons, the Shells, to say they're responsible for the harm caused. Some real question amongst legal practitioners as to whether those cases will ultimately be successful. They are unfolding across the country. There's also children who have similarly sued to say that their rights have been violated to a clean environment.
Right.
But where we know for sure there will be lots and lots of cases is on the adaptation or resilience side, either in the instance where someone wants to be more adaptive and they can't, which occurred in Connecticut. A couple after Sandy wanted to raise their home when they rebuilt it, but the local community said, well, that violates our aesthetic building code, so you can't raise your home. And the judge said, no, you can raise the home. On the flip side, we have adaptive measures in New Jersey where a huge sand dune is built, and the families complain. They say it's ruining our view, and that's still unfolding in the New Jersey courts as to whether there is a value to losing your view, which means that these measures may cost local communities a lot of money. So we don't know how it will ultimately unfold, and obviously there's the state and federal court system, but we know that it will take up a large portion of the docket for courts.
And, you know, we talk about the courts, but we forget that the courts are expressions of what's going on in everyday life. And I think an excellent example of this kind of conflict that companies and their communities, the communities they operate in, are experiencing now is the PG&E issue of turning off the power to prevent wildfires. But, you know, they could be taking the extra fees and burying their lines so they no longer need to turn off the power. And we don't think about that. We look at the conflict between the people without power and the company trying to reduce its liability. How can companies prepare to address climate change in partnership with those communities? What kinds of great examples of that have you seen?
Well, we do see companies stepping forward, particularly in disasters. Walmart comes to mind. Often they have opened their parking lots and distributed water, other emergency supplies, really to make sure that those communities get back up and running as quickly as possible. We also see private companies moving into the area of visualization of risk. Now, this is something that the consumer has to pay for, but downscaling data so that you can tell whether your house is at particular flood risk or some other kind of severe event could harm it. But what we don't have yet is companies systematically looking at their own risks, the risks to their supply chains. In 2011, terrible floods in Thailand. It basically wiped out most of the manufacturing of a particular component for cars, and three major automakers suffered a $2.8 billion loss as a result of that event. We need for companies to step back and look at what they're vulnerable to and reflect that in a way that's meaningful to investors and helps the companies themselves do a better job in preparing.
And those are shared vulnerabilities. And I think this is the challenge that people who try to talk about sustainability face, that it sounds like the company is saying, we're worried about that $2.8 billion loss. On the other hand, say in Sonoma County, they're worried about the $1 billion fire loss. But what we're all talking about is a shared tax on our future that we have to either pay up or we simply don't have a future.
Well, absolutely. I mean, when small businesses are closed as a result of PG&E preemptively shutting power, or they have, as I was anecdotally told, a small grocery store has $200,000 worth of frozen foods that are destroyed because they don't have a generator, that is an economic loss that hurts not only the individuals, but the overall economy.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to Santa Rosa tomorrow, and the hotel that I will be staying at was closed for a week. So they lost a week's income.
Exactly. And typically that is not insured. That kind of business disruption, they won't have coverage for that.
So the other side of this is the regulatory issue of the cities and how they zone and control what goes on inside their borders. Are cities liable for these changes, for the way that they put policy in place if they make mistakes? How does a politician make a good decision knowing both that there's a great deal of uncertainty and that we are getting a better understanding of what the potential outcomes are?
Well, that's a tough question for a politician, but generally most cities enjoy immunity. There's just a principle that you cannot sue your city for everything. So, and there's good reasons behind that, because you don't want a lawsuit over every decision. But there certainly have been attempts already to sue cities for failing to address the increased risk from climate change. And at some point, it may become so big a risk that it's really so negligent that there will be some suit that's successful. I haven't seen it yet. I've seen attempts to do so. I think the other place might maybe see some litigation is against professionals, for example, architects and engineers, for not warning their clients as to the deep risks posed to whatever they're constructing.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that the need to disclose is also going to be one of the things that drives greater awareness.
I believe so. I think if a building is built and someone forgets to tell them that, this is going to highly likely to flood in the near future, there could be liability as we have greater attribution science and as we have greater certainty that these events are causing deep harm.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about what's coming up in the 2020 election. And climate change is becoming clearly a major difference between the policies of the parties. And you in your book talk about the fact that climate resilience, building for the response to climate change must be a critical issue in the 2020 presidential campaign. How do you see, first off, the Trump administration's current climate change activity with regard to what we need to do? And how do you see the differences between the two parties playing out in 2020?
Well, there are two different issues with climate change. The first is cutting emissions, and it's a bit, frankly, abysmal what has occurred. We have lost very valuable time, and the Trump administration has been extremely hostile, from everything like pulling out of the Paris Agreement to undoing the attempts that were made in the previous administration to really get at cutting our emissions. On the other side of climate, which is adaptation to climate change, even though this administration is very reluctant to use the term climate change in public, there are areas within the federal government, notably FEMA, as well as HUD, that have begun to invest more deeply in mitigation measures and really looking at how do we cut risk in advance of the event so that we have less damage. There's very sound economic reasons for doing so. Every dollar that we spend in reducing risk can save anywhere from $4, $6, $12, in some instances over $200. So it's important that we make that investment early on. And with Congress, there is the Disaster Recovery Act, I think, Disaster Reform Recovery Act of 2018, which requires FEMA to set aside 6% of all the money it spends in a given year on disasters and put that 6% into disaster mitigation. We need far more money than that, but it's a very powerful step and goes far beyond what the Obama administration was able to accomplish in this area.
So how do you see our voters, in your opinion, becoming more tuned into the climate issue as 2020 approaches?
Voters will need to focus on what candidates say they're going to do about climate change. In my opinion, having worked on this issue deeply for a decade, this is an existential threat. It should be a very important decision factor as to who we have lead the nation, because during this period of time, the leadership will matter. We can make decisions today that will leave not only ourselves much better off, but future generations. So to be absent from the international stage and absent from mitigation efforts in the United States has definitively hurt us. There has been very positive movement by states and cities to cut emissions and build resilience, but it's not enough without the aid of the federal government.
So, and following on that, and the reluctance of the current administration to talk about climate change publicly, do you feel like increased transparency and particularly better dissemination of government data is going to be key to how citizens, business, and policymakers change over the next 5 to 10 years?
Absolutely. You know, we are awash in data. We have a lot of historical records as well as ongoing creation of records. And we need to make sure that that data, to the extent it's generated by the government, is accessible and it remains public. So that will be an important focus going forward because that will better inform choices. On the flip side, we also need greater investment in modeling future projections of climate change and then helping the mayors on the ground, the city councils understand what their risk, and that means we need to have a cadre of people who can translate this data and make it meaningful for the decision makers who have to choose how they're going to prepare and invest the dollars that are available for risk mitigation.
So artificial intelligence, the ability to look at the historic data, is also another way that we're becoming newly armed to deal with the complexity of this problem. And does that give you hope, or does it feel like we haven't put the AI together with the problem that we really need to solve?
Oh, we are already putting the AI with the problem. There are certainly a number of private entities that do this on a regular basis. I sit on the advisory board of one of them. And what they do is they take the historical records, and now with because we're already experiencing the impacts of climate change, our historical record includes some of these more extreme events. And then they're putting it through their analysis so that they can tell you where the vulnerabilities are for a particular community in terms of, it could be earthquake risk or flood risk. And that can really help emergency managers. It can help people make better decisions on the ground. No question.
The other thing that's happened is we're seeing more and more scientific organizations coming out and declaring a crisis. Just this week, about 1,100 scientists got together and issued an alert that we are facing an existential crisis. And about 3 weeks ago, Climate Central, another scientific organization, released a report that updated the projections of sea level changes. And it shows that 3 times as many people as we previously thought are at risk of becoming refugees during this century. Did you take a look at that, and did it raise the alarm for you, or had you already anticipated that it really was much worse than we thought?
Anyone working in this area recognizes that the public reports that have been put out are consensus-based. That means 190 nations have agreed, for example, to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. And all of those reports are based on peer-reviewed science, and that peer review process could take time. So I'll never forget former Energy Secretary Stephen Chu at an event I attended. We were talking about this problem of the science being, the consensus-based science not alerting us to how bad it could be. And he said basically you cannot trust anything in climate science that's more than a year old because it's changing so rapidly. In addition to that, our understanding is deepening as to how consequential these changes are. So all of us should assume that it could be worse than even the reports that are issued on an official basis, including the National Climate Assessment issued by the federal government. But if you just took those reports and read them straight up, it's horrifying enough. What is being pointed out in the Climate Central work is that there could be fundamental flaws in our understanding because our data isn't as strong. And what happened there was they were able to look at some of the our understanding of what sea level rise would look like, and it turned out the type of mapping we could do that supported those conclusions didn't include the fact that they were measuring land by the top of a tree, for example. So in fact, if you actually corrected and looked at what the base level of the land was, there could be far more severe sea level rise.
Well, and going back to Norfolk, subsidence of the land is another thing going on there. As you look at the data, and you've been looking at this for a decade, what percentage of American cities do you feel are at risk right now?
Substantial. 40% of the Americans live in coastal communities. We have the 2 very large coastlines, and all of those coastlines are at risk for some degree of sea level rise. For example, about 2 years ago, NOAA put out, our National Oceans Aeronautics Administration put out a report that Rhode Island could suffer by 2100 9 feet of sea level rise. Now, when people hear the 2100 figure, I think sometimes they think, in 2099, suddenly it'll jump 9 feet. No, that's not what obviously is going to happen. It will be coming in over time, and what we're already seeing is it's coming in faster. So year over year, we see more sea level rise, and that is just very dangerous for erosion, for salinization of water supplies, and simply complete loss of land.
So I know this is a difficult question to answer, but what year do you think that we really wake up to this? Because it's simply impossible to ignore.
One of the things I'm pretty excited about is I think we're waking up now in this current political cycle. Compared to the last round of elections, we have had so much more focus on climate change. in just the last year and a half, so many more stories, so much more attention paid by the media, by people outside of those that have historically focused on environmental issues. The circle is widening. I think a moment is occurring. We have Greta Thunberg, we have students protesting. A lot of attention is being paid to this. So to the extent that we can turn that to political power and will, there's a real opportunity right now to change the course. With that said, we already have baked in certain impacts because there's a delay in the deepening of heat from the actual emission of the carbon itself. And because of that delay, we will suffer continuing impacts for the coming decades, even if we got to zero emissions today. So we need to prepare for those anyway. Yeah,
and then carbon capture and the restoration of the environment is another step after we stop emitting more than the Earth can process. So it's an incredibly dynamic situation, one that we've never dealt with as a society before.
No, this is unprecedented in human history. It's occurring at a rate that's unprecedented, and it's the greatest challenge of our times, or of really human
All
history.
Time. Yeah.
And it's so important that we treat it that way. But it's difficult for the human brain to handle this. I heard a great quote. T.S. Eliot said, humankind can only handle so much reality at once. And that is a challenge here. It's such a big problem that people find it difficult to engage.
Yeah, and they tend to think of it as a problem that sort of falls down on them when in fact it's falling down, rising up, and closing in from the sides.
That's quite an analogy, but I think it's accurate.
Well, Alice, thank you very much for joining us today. And I hope you'll come back and talk more because this is a deep and evolving problem, obviously.
I'd be delighted to. Thank you for all your work on this issue.
Well, thank you. Folks, that's Alice Hill. She's the co-author with Leo Martinez of Building a Resilient Tomorrow, How to Prepare for the Coming Climate Disruption, available today on Amazon.com. And that's published by Oxford University Press if you're looking for it. So, folks, do take the time to read. This is Mitch Ratcliffe, and Earth 911 will be back with another innovator interview soon. Thanks very much.